Welcome to In Between Charges, the perfect podcast to listen to whilst waiting for your EV to charge. This is our 4th season, and as ever, I'm joined by my co-host, Kevin Spangenberg. Kevin, how are we doing? Welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah, excited to be here for our 4th season. We're filming this in the middle of August. Got a little comeback of summer weather here to finish off Copenhagen summer strong, and so we're enjoying that. We have our summer party this Friday.
We do have a summer party this Friday.
Bohemian theme, so bring your tie-dye.
Cocktails and mocktails and maybe a barbecue out on the balcony. Let's see. But we're very excited for today's episode. And this week we are welcoming a guest from Einride. And Einride is a Swedish technology and heavy-duty vehicle manufacturer who are not just moving freight, but are also building a pan-European and American charging network for their electric heavy vehicles and also for those of their customers. And their US rollout started. They also have operations across Sweden, Norway, the UK, Germany, and beyond. It's also a company that's recognized for its truly end-to-end approach. So focusing not just on in-house software, but also building out of electric logistical programs, proprietary charging infrastructure, as well as the manufacturing of EV freight vehicles, hopefully leading us into a greener and possibly driverless freight future. This month, this episode, we're joined by Anne-Lise Deraedt, VP of Charging Infrastructure at Einride, who is the center of this effort and joins us today. Anne-Lise, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very happy to be joining you today.
Great. Okay, so let's get started. So I think what stood out to us, obviously, Monta, our big focus is charging infrastructure, working with operators of various different sizes across all use cases, whether it's depot fleets all the way through to workplace and then also home charging. Infrastructure is always a core component of what we do and what we offer into the market. And what strikes us very, very clearly when you look at Einride as a company, it's obviously positioned as a mobility and a logistics business, but really considers infrastructure a core component of your strategy. So can you help us just to understand a little bit there from your origins as a heavy-duty vehicle manufacturer? Why did Einride decide to actually step into and really invest in charging infrastructure?
Yes, for sure. So Einride started 2016 with the idea of answering many challenges that they were seeing in the heavy-duty logistic world, meaning congestions in the city, quite a lot of pollution, noise, and safety as well. And from all these points, the idea of having autonomous electric vehicles and green logistics was born. And when embarking on that journey with autonomous electric technology, the way forward was to actually learn and understand what it means to be driving electric. And to do so, while developing the autonomous technology, the company decided to start operating electric freight, already starting 2021, which was one of the first ones doing that for heavy-duty vehicles. There was very little hardware out there on the market and basically zero charging infrastructure. So in the same way that we started the journey at Einride looking at, okay, we need to drive electric, we have a truck, we have a system to plan it, we need to charge. That's how charging came into play. And the first answer to that was basically to look into depot infrastructure. That was the fastest, most of the time easiest way to go live with electric operations with heavy-duty trucks. Usually on warehouses or depot places, you have a little bit of grid available, you have some space, and you can put 1, 2, 3, even 4 charge points if you want. Looking into scalability and the plans that we have with the company, meaning that we want to deploy quite a lot of electric trucks, supporting electrification, a massive electrification of heavy-duty transport, we very, very soon decided to look into what else do we need in addition to depot charging, and how do we make this massive electrification possible. And that's how we entered into the public offering that we now have deployed quite massively in Sweden already.
So at the start, you had the truck idea, the logistics idea, the freight idea, but then you pretty quickly were like, where will we charge these vehicles? And were you initially expecting other companies to fill that gap? And then you were a little bit underwhelmed by what other companies or other CPOs were able to provide. So you said, we need to take this upon ourselves and build out our own charging. And it started as behind the fence. And then you also quickly realized we need to be building some stops around the country and around the continent to support what we want to do from a freight perspective.
Well, basically, electrification has been in the talk for a long time, but it has been in the talk mainly from an OEM perspective. With my previous experience with truck OEM, the electrification was in the roadmap since a long time. But in 2016, when Einride started, there was no OEM really there yet. So the idea was, how do we speed that up? Because the problem of pollution congestions and making sure that we build a more sustainable and greener future was already there. So the idea was, how do we speed that up? And the answer was, okay, let's try to find some hardware that we can put on the road and start driving electric. But we couldn't rely on anybody else that would build this infrastructure at that point in time. When I joined the company 3.5 years ago, there was no infrastructure out there. So it was very difficult to just rely on somebody else to do that. There was a lot that was in focus for passenger cars. That was the boom of the infrastructure for passenger cars. But when we're talking about trucks, it's very much different. We're talking about very big beasts that take more space, that demand more energy, and that needs a specific dedicated infrastructure because of the schedule that is behind. With a clear schedule, and time is money.
So I guess it's interesting because we see similar approaches with some of the other heavy-duty vehicle developers. So Milence, for example, building out its own charging network, and then Scania also building out its own charging network for Arinion. And as you're saying, it's a way to build confidence and trust when you're working with, you have some very strong flagship partners. I saw the partnership with Carlsberg, also driving to zero together with the zero emission beer that they've promoted, which is obviously very popular and very interesting here in Copenhagen. So it's a way of demonstrating that you have certainty that your trucks will reach A to Z. But I guess also they have a very different just physical need. These are big vehicles that we're talking about, not just the cabling that's needed to be able to power a 350 or 450 kilowatt charger, but also enough space to be able to turn around, go into the parking spot, amenities, etc. nearby. So maybe then I understand how charging is a core part of what you offer and what you do, but could you maybe give us a little bit of insight into what your site selection process actually looks like? Because the conversations that we've had with other businesses focusing on heavy duty is that it's as much a land grab as it is a grid grab. There is very much a kind of a limited time period of which these high traffic zones and locations will basically be snapped up by various different operators. So how do you go about that, and how do you compete with other network operators that are trying to fill this space?
Yeah, that's very much what it is about. Finding a place where you have some grid available and that makes sense in terms of density of traffic that is going to be driving around there. So what we've done, and we started in Sweden, being a Swedish company and Sweden being one of the early adopters for electrification, is to actually look for sites with the angle that Einride has transport. So logistic transport that we needed to support with charging infrastructure. So I would say that's the main difference between us and some other competitors looking into charging infrastructure. We actually support our own transport flow. And that means that we know where to build because we already have operations in these areas, or we know that we will have operations in these areas very soon, which helps us both in defining where exactly to scout for land. And then it has been quite a lot about making the match between the logistics flow and, as you said, the grid availability. And in Sweden, we've been lucky enough that we have found several of these sites. We already have 8 sites up and running, which means that we have one of the biggest network of truck dedicated charging station along the major transport corridor in Sweden.
Yes. So my, I guess, interpretation of that is charging infrastructure for Einride has been a very important catalyst to be able to build confidence in the customers that you want to target, to be able to essentially bring them onto your transportation network and really create your own freight network, essentially, because you know those routes. It's where you will have a high volume of your vehicles going through, and potentially also there will be quicker routes or faster locations to be able to get to some of the delivery spots that you want to look at. But then also beyond it, charging infrastructure is a long-term play for Einride as well. It's not something which is only invest to begin with, build confidence, and then position on the side. We have a lot of this conversation in the market about the owner versus operate model. Some operators go for a very asset heavy. They focus on getting the lead, which is 10 to 15 years, maybe even more than that. There are some leases we see for 50 years plus. You own the infrastructure and set that up too. But there are others that tend to focus a little bit more on a lighter method, focusing much more on partnerships. How deeply is Einride investing in that? What's your approach? Do you go down the owner-operator model, and why is that?
Yes, that's a very good question. Einride is at the core a tech company, so focusing quite a lot on the software and making sure that electric and autonomous as possible from a software perspective. But that means that infrastructure is something that is not secret for anyone. It is asset heavy, so it is quite capital intensive. And to that extent, we have formed partnerships. One of our partners being Polar Structure and another one, Catena in Sweden. So companies really focusing on sustainability and on making sure that electrification is happening and that are willing to actually invest in this kind of projects so that we still keep quite a lot of the operation in-house at Einride because of the strengths of the software that we have and the knowledge of the logistics business that we have as well. So that's really what we bring into the partnership. That's in addition to the concept that we have developed for building the infrastructure, meaning that based on the relationships that we have with a different carrier, we can optimize the site layout, we can optimize the modularity of the site because we want to build something that is scalable, meaning that we have a modular concept that can expand when the market is ready and developing even more towards heavy-duty electrification.
You joined the company 3.5 years ago, I think you mentioned, and you're describing kind of the journey of Einride to becoming a heavy-duty CPO. Has this flipped then from the Einride side to a revenue line item where it's like, wow, actually, this is turning out to be a pretty revenue-driving or profit-driven venture? Or is it still kind of in the facilitating phase to make sure that you're supporting the freight business and the logistics? Or is it its own team that you're leading up and there's actually like, hey, we put these sites in and this utilization is really ticking up and we're expecting this to drive some revenue in the coming years?
Utilization is really at the core of charging infrastructure for heavy trucks. So that's definitely of essence for us to understand how do we want to position ourselves. And as much as the starting point was to support our transport, we also know that opening up our facilities to external customers is really the key for us to be able to scale and to make sure that we answer to the demand of electrification. One of the first questions we get is, okay, how far can you drive? And this range anxiety is starting to fade a bit more now. The more we see infrastructure developed on the road, but that's still quite a critical point. So for us to make sure that we remove that blocker and that we really enable the electrification of heavy-duty transport, the opening of the infrastructure that we build to support, to a certain extent, our transport, makes totally sense to also open it for external customer. And yeah, it is a revenue-generating area for the company.
So you mentioned utilization as a key metric there. And I think if you probably did a keywords analysis over the last, whatever it is, 7.5 months, this year in this industry, it would probably be the biggest term. If you saw a thought bubble, utilization would be big and it would be dead on in the center, and then profitability and some other things would be around there. It's everything that we hear about a lot. It's been a challenging year, I guess, ups and downs, changing in administration, changing in tax and policy incentives, but we still see sales of EVs and then also heavy duties continue to increase. But there's definitely a shift from put the chargers in the ground and your drivers will come through to actually what makes a really well-performing site to be able to demonstrate repeatable utilization and sustainable growth. So utilization is one of those benchmarks that you look at, but what does a top performing site really look like for Einride? How do you measure that? And what are some of the metrics that you really focus on?
Utilization is definitely the biggest, as you mentioned. That's really the core of every discussion when you build a site. Will we have the utilization? How does it look like? Our strength is that we have a base of transport that we know is going to come for the basic utilization of the site. I would say utilization in combination of modularity of the site, because we can decide to build very big to start with, but our approach was to build modular. So if we can, with our site, facilitate the adoption of electric trucks, that means that in a year or two from now, we will be able to increase the charging infrastructure that we already have. So the whole idea is to start with reasonable utilization versus size of the site at geographical points that make sense from a traffic density perspective. So when you combine all these three aspects, you get some kind of insurance that in the future, you will be able to increase the number of charge poles that you have there and be able to serve more electric trucks.
How long are we talking with the permitting process and everything up in Sweden? I'm sure that's a fun challenge that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. How long from scoping out a site to doing the engineering and analysis and applying for permits till a site is energized and live? What type of time frame are we talking about here?
I would say it depends. The team has been doing wonders with making things happen very fast. The fastest deployment we've had is below 4 months, including the permitting. That comes with the very clear plan and the concept that we already have developed before. So the first site didn't take less than 4 months, of course, but now we are able to deploy quite fast.
It's an incredible time. So congrats with 4 months because, for us, we can hear anything from 9 months to 3 years.
That's something that we're also facing outside of Sweden, or even in Sweden. If grid is not available, then we know that it's going to be much longer. It's a matter of the stars aligning somehow with the grid, with the right plot of land, and making sure that we can make that happen fast.
So if you're a startup CPO out there, Sweden's where you can go and take a little capital and you can find a plot of land and navigate the permitting. You can get that up and going quickly in Sweden. Germany, Netherlands, maybe a little tougher to get off the ground. Let's talk a little bit about site design and amenities that are incorporated in Einride sites. So my LinkedIn feed is filled up with CPOs, both in Europe and America, who are always very proud of their sites. They're doing big ribbon cutting ceremonies, and there's quite a bit of variation in some of these sites. Some of them look quite impressive. BP Pulse just opened a big one in Los Angeles that looked really nice, and Iona is opening some cool ones in the US with these big canopies. But then there's others that are not the most impressive sites, I have to say, but Einride sites have really caught my eye, some of these ones that you've opened up recently, especially the design and the thought that has gone into it. There's a nice cream-colored wood. I like cream myself. About half my closet is cream, so I'm partial to this. But it really does seem like a lot has gone into how you're designing these sites. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why you're taking this approach and really putting some more thought into the design as opposed to just putting a couple of heavy-duty chem power chargers in and just saying, we'll bring in the heavy-duty trucks. Why is the layout and the architecture so important for Einride?
Yeah, that's something I'm actually extremely proud of. So from the very beginning, we've been strongly working with the design team at Einride. So they have been part of the concept from the beginning so that we actually make sure we're building a brand, basically. And the idea is that it doesn't matter which station you stop at, as if it's an Einride station, you will know it directly. And that's why we have some of these iconic elements like the canopies, the big signage that we have on all our sites as well. That's something that is really a true collaboration between engineering and design. And that's something that is, again, I'm very, very proud and amazed about the work that the team has done on that front. And the idea was to really link the function of the different components and make them into strong branding elements. If you think about trucking, it doesn't maybe look super glamorous. We want to change that a bit. I mean, it doesn't have to be dirty. It doesn't have to be dark. And the idea with what Einride does is really to take it to the next level and change what maybe has been the standard for many years.
I don't think truck stops in our imagination are not viewed as sanitary, wonderful, nice places, but I think the direction that you're taking this and the way you just described it is fantastic, and it's sustainable, it's clean, it's pleasant. And maybe now the truck drivers of 2030 are going to have a much better 35-minute break than they did 20 years ago, right, when they're stopping there. And I just think that's a fantastic approach.
You really bring the Scandinavian-design aspect into the whole setup. So perhaps less sexy and maybe less interesting than design of the sites, but just as, if not more important, is the topic about pricing. We've been looking at the spikes that we see every single summer in charging and how particularly the fast charging operators are trying to capture as big a share of that pie as possible. And more often than not, part of the strategy is creating some sort of summer promotion on pricing. And you really do see the utilization change. Utilization of charge points is negatively correlated with the price of that charge. So price sensitivity is something that our drivers have. How does price sensitivity, or how does Einride consider a pricing strategy for a very different subset of drivers?
We know how price sensitive this industry is. It's a very low margin industry for which the electrification represents quite a high investment. The trucks are still more expensive than diesel trucks, and you don't have infrastructure everywhere. So when you go electric, you don't do just a one by one change. You look at which route are actually electrifiable, what kind of payload can you transport with the hardware that is available on the market right now. In terms of price sensitivity, we also know that it's part of the TCO of the operations for the carrier and for the shipper, which means that we need to be very, very aggressive on that, which is why we link quite strongly the design and the modularity concept of the site to cost optimization, so that we then can work towards a low price towards the users. One of the issues being also there the price of the electricity. So the volatility of the electricity price being a bit more difficult to predict than the diesel. There is a lot of optimization that can be done so that we schedule the charging sessions at lower energy prices. And that's really how you start to go into optimization. And that's really when the Einride software starts to come into play with this strong asset, basically, because that's something that we can monitor and we are able to plan and we are able to make sure that you will get an electric transport to its best price.
It's actually really interesting to hear that heavy duty vehicle drivers and your customers are more price sensitive. And of course, that makes sense. As you say, it's a very low margin business and they need more predictability of costs over a period of time. But trying to provide predictability of costs, as we know in this industry, is very difficult, particularly when we're trading kilowatt hours and that unit price varies significantly. And so we see various different types of pricing strategies deployed. So Electra, for example, has just come out that they would be dropping their flat fee over August, where there's a big period of summer holidays in France. Uno X also goes out and promotes its flat fee price. Last year, they did a really big promotion during the Tour de France, and you can see that on all their banners. But also a lot of operators that we work with, if there's a dynamic tariff available, we enable them to offer a dynamic pricing tariff so they can guarantee their margin, but they can also share out with customers when things will be cheaper. What's Einride's approach to that? How do you price out to your current customers? Do you go on contracts before? Do you offer flat fee or do you offer dynamic pricing? Or maybe something else?
The true strategy that we have for when it comes to energy is to really go with dynamic pricing, because that's when we really can be as optimal as possible. But this comes with the challenge that, then the predictability is more difficult to have. We also have quite a lot of data showing that over a year, dynamic pricing presents more advantages than having a flat fee. Obviously, when you go for flat fees, you add some risks into it. So that means slightly more expensive price. But we have to combine the expectation of the carriers and the shippers with what it means to actually drive electric and source electricity and how we can make that as attractive as possible. And for us, dynamic pricing is really the key for that. But in addition to dynamic pricing, that's also something that I mentioned before regarding the energy solutions. We also have started implementing battery energy storage at our stations, mainly to support the stability of pricing of electricity or pricing of the charging stations that we have at our sites.
So that's interesting. You mentioned the batteries on site kind of serving as a buffer and maybe a way to reduce costs. Is that due to demand charges? Maybe that's not quite the right terminology in Sweden, but we know in the US and in a number of countries, they call them demand charges, right? Where they say, if we're going to keep this big amount of power basically on reserve, we don't know when 6 trucks are going to pull up at the same time, but just in case 6 trucks pull up at the same time, we're going to have this elevated kilowatt hour pricing. Is that what you're having to deal with in Sweden? And that's why you're putting these batteries on site that are then trickle charged throughout the day. So then the charger then pulls from the battery and is not pulling extra from the grid?
So maybe both yes and no. The stations are dimensioned to be able to accommodate 6 to 8 trucks at the same time. Knowing that depending on the need for the charge, not all trucks come at the same time with the same needs. So we can definitely work with power allocation. That's something that we have in our software. And power prioritization is also something that we have launched in May. The battery is really there so that we can optimize the cost towards the customer. That means that if we have a dynamic pricing strategy, say that you would come at the time of the day where the electricity is the most expensive, thanks to the battery storage, we would reduce that. And that really means that when you cannot adapt the flow, because the flow's schedule are most of the time pretty fixed, we are trying to make sure that if you have to charge at the most expensive time, you will still get a competitive price, and that we manage with the battery storage.
So the question we always finish on is a bit of a myth buster. So if you were to bust one myth about EVs, heavy duty vehicles, or EV charging, what would it be?
I would say this range anxiety problem, it's no longer a problem anymore. I mean, we have quite a lot of big trucks out there. The E600 from Mercedes, for example, is quite impressive when it comes to range and battery size. So that's something that nowadays, with the infrastructure that is there, and maybe a second one would be that we need a lot of power to do that. Both yes and no. Most of the time we can optimize the schedule and the flow so that you can have top-up charges. You can use the 8 hours for the driver to rest to actually have long overnight charging, so you don't need that much power. And really by looking at the full ecosystem of what do we actually need, and could we just tweak a little, add 5 minutes there, remove 5 minutes here, we can definitely make quite a lot and integrate the charging in a very, very efficient way.
Amazing. Thank you. And maybe just a final one, because as you're speaking as well, I completely agree. Range anxiety is also something that we don't tend to hear about too much anymore, at least in the more developed charging infrastructure within Europe. But then how about autonomous self-driving in the EV space and charging? Because obviously that's a big focus for Einride at the moment. You have a few fun projects that's going out.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea is really to go electric to reach then electric autonomous operations. And that's something that we have commercial contracts on already, both in the US and in Europe. The use case is still very much limited to fenced areas, although we also have had operations on open roads. And that's something that definitely makes sense. We are also looking into charging solutions for autonomous vehicles as well. And that's something that is going to be very much on focus in the coming years as well. For depot solution to start with, again, same journey for autonomous transport than for electric transport, so to say, starting with depot because that's where we see the most need for it, and then increasing to offsites when we have the autonomous trucks out on the open road.
Fantastic. Great. Anne-Lise, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and the really good conversation. All the best for Einride and good luck with the opening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we'll see you in Helsingør.
See you there.